Historically, qualitative analysis was always the poor cousin of the more exciting and seemingly more difficult topic of how to moderate. But I think online qual has changed all that, really, or at least brought qualitative analysis into the fore. So it's great to have this opportunity to talk about it and share some of the things that I've learned about how to find the story in qualitative analysis. And just a little bit of information about me. So bit of background, really. I've been a qualitative researcher for a long time, and of course I've done all the usual forms of qualitative research. I've also been interested in social media analysis, and ethnography, that kind of thing, which requires a different kind of analysis. And was lucky enough for quite a long time to be exposed to a client satisfaction program which generated, I think, about 1,000 interviews across each year, which also needed to be analysed. But also I do something else, which I'm going to be talking about in more depth a little bit later on, which is that my agency, we do a lot of one-on-one interviews with samples of about 30. So you can end up with transcripts, 30 hours worth of transcripts, for example, that you need to do something with. So it is something that I've needed to learn how to do. But also I'm going to nail my colours to the mast pretty much at this point, because I'm not one of those quick insights kind of people. My view is, if it was a quick insight, it wasn't an insight at all. That the reason to analyse at all is that you need to think about things. You need to think clearly, and you need to think carefully, and you need to allow yourself the time. So that's me nailing my colours to the mast. The reason for talking about finding a story within from the qualitative analysis perspective, last year I spoke about the first part of it, which was about the more detailed coding side. This time I've gone right to the other end and talking about finding the story, because one of the real weaknesses in market research and qualitative research has been that people just get completely mired in description. They just tell the client what they heard instead of what it all meant. So I think storytelling skills can really help us. So before we obviously do that, so I'm going to tell you a story. Actually, I'm going to tell you 3, really just to be clear about what I mean by story and what the kind of stories that I think are useful for us. Now, you might be familiar with this fable, The Tortoise and the Hare. As you might know, the story is an Aesop fable where there was once a speedy hare who bragged about how fast he could run. The slow and steady tortoise was fed up with hearing about that and challenged him to a race. The hare was so overconfident that he fell asleep during the race, and of course the tortoise won by being slow and steady. And for Aesop, the moral of the story was that slow and steady won the race. The moral of the story from my point of view is that the reason that's such a memorable story is that it involves characters, albeit animals, but characters, and that is lesson number 1 for qualitative analysis as far as I'm concerned. It's to think about your analysis in terms of characters and types of characters. The second element of a really good story, and this is a different type of story and a familiar one, is that these kinds of stories always have tension, like The Tortoise and the Hare, and clearly this the Star Wars story here. There's conflict in the story, or there's something that needs to be resolved, or sometimes it's more like there's surprise in the story and that needs to be resolved. So that's part of telling a story. But those kinds of stories that we mostly talk about aren't necessarily the best model for research, as far as my experience has taught me. So rather than the moral of the story being the interesting thing, what our clients want to know is who won. And so in this case, the story is the tortoise won. And as I've got here, in last night's race, the tortoise narrowly defeated the race favourite, the hare, who initially set off at a cracking pace but then disappeared until moments before the tortoise was about to cross the line. There are unverified reports from the field of a hare asleep under a tree on the roadside during the race, and the tortoise put her success down to her slow and steady pace. So the model there, from a report perspective, is that we start out with what it means, the tortoise won. Then our next part of focus is giving the detail of that, and we can get into more and more detail as we wish. So it makes it a more memorable story in that we focused on what the client wanted to know, and we focused on characters. But there are a couple of other things to say about this. One of the mistakes that you can make very easily in qualitative analysis is to go to the headline like this, what it means for the client, and stay there, and then just get locked into your own belief that you've got the answer right, when in actual fact the real process ought to be one of toing and froing between the data and the headline or the findings, just to really challenging yourself all the time. Is this actually the answer, and is it actually the most useful way of putting the answer, so the client can use it? So it's very much an iterative process, and I'll come back to that point. There is a second point that comes out of this. This is a very simple story, and simplicity is absolutely the key to making a memorable story. And part of our real challenge in qualitative analysis is turning messy subjective qualitative data into something simple and easy to understand. The master probably to follow in all of this is the writer Anton Chekhov, from whom there has developed a principle called Chekhov's gun, which you might not know. And he said, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. And that's a moral of the story for all those people who create far too many PowerPoint slides, I would argue. So that's part of the job of qualitative analysis, is actually to get that rifle off the wall. So all of these stories that I've just illustrated engage readers differently. So they engage readers perhaps through characters, they engage readers through tension or conflict or resolution of the tension, as in the tortoise winning. And they suit different learning styles, because we need to be conscious of the fact when we're analysing our data that data is going to be used by people who have different learning styles. So that's another aspect of qualitative analysis which often isn't considered, I have to say. So how does all this story stuff relate to qualitative analysis? Well, really it's about the fact that thinking about story structures helps us solve the problem with qualitative data, which we have on the next slide, which is that qualitative data is messy and subjective, and includes all of the things I've got here. It includes what was said, words, phrases, metaphors used, the images shared. It includes things like how evenly balanced was the interaction, how engaged were your participants. It includes things like whether opinions were accepted and whether they were challenged. But then it also includes what wasn't said, so the words and image not used, the unbalanced conversations, the silences and the topics avoided. And then it also includes what you thought or felt. Were you surprised by what was said? Did you have a sense of what was implied but not said? Could you get a sense of what was assumed rather than stated? And whether some things you quite simply didn't believe. So all of that is part of the data that you're working with as qualitative researchers. And of course it's messy, it's subjective, it has no structure. So there are two ways of turning that into structure, one of which is good. Well, one of which is better than the other, to be fair. And the one of which I don't think is so good is on the left, which is the classic bullet list approach. So you can just write your findings as a list of bullet points, and it suits auditory listeners really, because all they're just going is bullet, 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 and that's fine. But a bullet list doesn't have any order generally. It doesn't have any structure. So every time you see a new bulleted list, you have to start again and think, well, what is all this meaning? Which requires a little bit of cognitive effort, a lot of cognitive effort really, on behalf of the reader or the listener. And lists aren't engaging, so lists are not memorable. So that use sparingly is the best approach. In contrast, if you think of trying to turn your qualitative analysis rather than into lists into stories, you've got more chance of suiting all learning styles. You've got more chance of making it personal, coherent, and familiar, so people remember it. They remember it because it's more engaging. So look, I'm not saying a qualitative report is as engaging as Star Wars, but it could be a little bit more engaging than a list of bullet points. So that's why we want to think about turning qualitative analysis as, thinking of qualitative analysis as a story. I'm just going to talk for a minute, though, about the qualitative analysis process. The answers to contemporary market research questions includes a section on qualitative analysis, which uses this format. It talks about the fact that there are 7 stages, from collecting and organising the data to identifying, categorising, observing, interpreting, and writing the report. And as it says there, qualitative analysis stops when you finish the report. So as soon as you finish the report, you've stopped analysing, which makes it really very different from quantitative analysis. The other aspect of that is, although when writing about qualitative analysis, you more or less have to show it as a linear step. It isn't. It's, if anything, it's more like this. It's interconnected. There's a lot of toing and froing and changing and jumping from one thing to the other. So that's all described in the chapter in the textbook. And as I said earlier, it's about jumping from the micro to the macro and the macro to the micro, and really challenging yourself. Have I got it right? Have I got it right? As you go through. So, having argued for creating a story out of messy qualitative data, I'm now going to talk about different ways to find that story. And first of all, I'll concentrate on one aspect of it, which is finding characters, like the tortoise and the hare. Finding actions, responses, and perceptions of those characters, and then, sorry about that, and then identifying what's surprising, or what's the tension, or where the conflict is in the findings, and then resolving that. So I'm going to show you actually what might be a slightly surprising example, because what I've got here is a simple story about complex products. My agency's been fortunate enough to do a lot of work for the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, which they publish, which therefore makes it possible for me to talk about. Don't be put off. It does look technical, but it doesn't have to be. This is retail investor research into structured, capital protected and capital guaranteed investments. This is a result of 30-hour-long interviews about these very complex products. This, just think hedge funds, derivatives, you know, complex stuff. But looking at it now, you think, yeah, okay, that does look a bit complex. But what's astonishing to me about this is that I've had complete strangers report the findings of this to me. In one case, he knew that I'd written the report, and he said, oh, you're the person who wrote that report, who said blah, blah, which I'll tell you in a minute. But other people just told me the results of the findings, not appearing to know that I'd actually written the words they were sharing back with me, which means that it was memorable. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more now. This was the main finding of this report, the story, that risk seekers and risk avoiders, we're talking investors, were both attracted to the same product. Now that's the unusual thing, because usually that doesn't happen. So then we go on to, well, this is what happened in this case. 2 types of investors were attracted to the same investment product, but for completely different reasons. Risk seekers took a risk for a high return on their investment, and risk avoiders wanted to avoid risk by avoiding the share market. So they both invested in products labelled capital protected or capital guaranteed, on the understanding that they would get their capital back. Then the GFC happened, and these investments were derivatives based. Some were converted by cash to the investment managers and locked, which meant that the capital might not be returned and would not grow, and in some cases was not returned. So the moral of the story for investors is, don't invest in something you don't understand, and the moral for the industry is about truth in labelling. Now, I think you'll probably remember something about that story, that the risk seekers and risk avoiders chose the same product. But what I could have done was to analyse the findings rather than about people, but about themes or about attitudes, and done it this way. So we could have said, analysed it and then reported it as attitudes to investing. Investors describe their attitudes as conservative, for example, attitudes to risk, and then the outcome for the investor. Everything here is exactly what I just said on the other slide, but I challenge you to remember it. It is not as it's not as memorable and as easy to understand as the first one was, and it was analysis by focusing on characters that got us there. So what we've done, let's just over here. Okay, so our first step was to identify characters, different segments of the population, risk seekers, risk avoiders. What we need to do next is to categorize the findings and observe patterns in that data, which are we going back to the answers to contemporary market research questions format here. So let me just find this. Okay, so how to do this? I'm going to suggest what is probably an unusual way of finding this, of observing patterns and categorizing the findings, because what we're trying to do is find a central idea, find our story, and I'm also going to do something which is, let me just move on to the next one. Oh, here we go. So I've got 3 suggestions for you, and the first suggestion is to draw it, and I mean draw it, you know, with pencil and paper and whatever. The second one is to think about the implications, and the third is to adapt your storytelling style to your client. Drawing the story is where I'm going to go for the rest of the talk today. But I'm going to slightly mislead you, I'm afraid, because what I have done is to create some PowerPoint slides when, in actual fact, what they would have been pen and paper drawings that I would have done. So this is internal analysis. It might look like presentation format. It's not intended to be. This is intended to be you thinking and you trying to work things out as the analyst. So we're very much in analysis stage here, not presentation stage. So one of the types of, so when I say draw, what I typically mean is draw a diagram. In this case, it's a Venn diagram to represent qualitative data, where we're looking at the overlap between these 2 different segments. That's an easier example, but if you want to try and map out and work out what the relationships are, a Venn diagram is a great way to start. You don't have to present it to the client, it's just helping you think. The next one here is a fishbone diagram, and it's called that because it's supposed to look like a fishbone, though my diagrams never do. But here, the essential idea that we're trying to work out is why some investors lost money. We've got the arrows, which we've identified as the factors. You say, okay, some people lost money. Why is that? Okay, well, investors misunderstood. Some understood what protection meant, didn't mean what they thought it meant. Some trusted brand names. Some were influenced by advice and some by a culture of wealth. And then the blue boxes describe identify some of the factors that then go into, for example, misunderstanding protection. It was a use of the word and the 100-page disclosure documents that contributed to people misunderstanding. So at this point, you're breaking down what you were told in the interviews or you found in the data, but in mind you have this central idea all the way through. Why did some investors lose their money? What caused it? So this isn't a good example for identifying causes. Another one also would be just a diagram. This is, in a sense, the central tension in the story for that report, which is the conflicting issues, the government's obligation to protect the system, and the individual's right to choose. So should investors be allowed to invest in things in which they lose money? Should the government step in? So that's the tension in that. And then another diagram which can help you think and is part of the analysis process is a force field diagram, which is thinking about, well, all right, this happened, this is probably not such a good thing, how can this be changed? And a force field diagram compares the driving forces against restraining forces. So here we might say investing in education was, let's look at this, government programs could be the driving force here, but the wealth culture could be the restraining force. Now, you could put this in bullet form, but thinking it through like this and thinking it through diagrammatically can be enormously helpful to turning your data into a story that works for the client. And I've only just shown you, 4. There are many more, and you can make your own up. I think I actually made up the seesaw diagram myself. So it's not like you have freedom here, freedom to analyze. So to bring all this to a close, the moral of my story is that for great qual analysis, first of all, you need to organize your data so that you can find your story through characters. Not themes, not bullet points, characters. You start with the finding, but don't stop there. You start with the finding and keep doing the macro-micro thing that I talked about. You make it personal, so lists aren't personal, lists aren't memorable. You tell the story, don't just describe, because you want it to be memorable and actionable. And finally, I've just talked about a couple of types of stories. There are plenty of other stories that can be equally inspiring for turning qualitative data into action. And for example, so I've put here learn about archetypes and other stories. So there are plenty of stories out there and plenty of other inspiration in that sense.